welcome to this seminar. My name is Jerome Egli. I'm the president of the data privacy community. And as I heard, you get in touch with Ursula Suri, which also made the contact to you. So I'm very happy to meet you. Unfortunately, I don't have a camera on my laptop. So this is a business laptop, and it's
security settings.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's why you can see me. But I hope we can meet in another meeting sometime, for example, in Skype meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would like to make a short introduction to the seminar, and I'm as a president of the data privacy community, I would like to welcome everybody to this seminar with you, Siarhei, and it's a great pleasure to meet you, and I'm very happy that we could engage you for this 1 hour seminar. Siarhei, you will tell us more about the difficulties in distinguishing between personal data and anonymized data. And I'm very curious what you will tell us. And well, yes, I would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself briefly. And well, there's a small addition. I hope everyone agrees with the recording of this session.
Thank you for introduction. A little bit about myself. I'm Sergei Varankevich. My major profession is GDPR consultant, but I also share my knowledge and experience at the course that I developed. It's called Data Privacy Professional course, and I am certified Information Privacy Professional Europe and certified Information Privacy Manager. I used to work and live in Munich, and it was the time when I was working with Allianz SE there, and I wrote my MBA thesis devoted to the regulation and defended it at Hochschule Bremen. So here I'm going to use the content of my course that is Data Privacy Professional course. It's one of the modules that I usually include in the program, and this course is mostly for people who are going to take the position of data privacy officer, data protection officer. So I was trying to explain it to my students for a number of years, and I found out that you need to divide and split the definition of personal data. And for the last 2.5 years, I was developing this concept. I have got a lot of feedback of my students, and they are much more proficient in finding out all the personal data that are in their organization and keeping the records of processing activities required by the Article 30 of the GDPR. We'll start with the definition. It's quite complicated legal definition, which consists of 3 things, 3 definitions inside. As you can see, there is definition of the data subject, the definition or kind of examples of the identifier, along with the definition of personal data. So I had a lot of cases when the company started GDPR compliance project, and they were starting, of course, with the data register required by Article 30, and they were sending the questionnaires to their employees. And the question was whether they have personal data in their departments, and they got some answers and started the projects. And after some audit or looking inside the processing operations, they were finding and discovering much more data than was declared. So the problem with this is that you are creating the gaps inside the organization that you are unaware of, and those data that are not declared by the employees might be quite sensitive and might expose the organization to the regulatory risks, fines, and it will also be hard to execute the subject access requests from the data subject because the organization doesn't know the full scope of personal information that is available inside the organization. So, based on the opinion by the European Supervisory Authority, which was used to be called Article 29 Data Protection Working Party, and based on the guidelines, quite fresh guidelines of Irish Supervisory Authority, along with analysis of the 108 plus convention that was adopted by European Union members, I created this concept. And usually when I'm teaching data privacy, I start with the very basic, with the verb identification. What does identification mean? So to identify means to distinguish an element from all other elements in the group. So when we are speaking about individuals, identifying individual means just distinguishing one individual from others. So you don't know and you cannot distinguish these four individuals. But when you discovered some properties, some feature of this individual, you may distinguish him or her from other group members. So it doesn't mean that you have to know his or her name or personal number. It's just having some identifier that helps you with distinguishing this person. I usually show this graphic. It shows the levels of personal data. Inside you have, of course, you have a data subject. So the data subject is a person that the data relates to. And you have the body of the person. And the second level, the second layer is identifier. This is the property that is closely connected to the person, that is usually unique, that is hard to change. And GDPR in the Article 4 names some identifiers. So you can see the list of identifiers, but this is not complete or comprehensive list. And it starts from the name, identification number, location data, online identifier, and the number of factors specific for the person. So all of this creates this first layer surrounding data subject. As you can see on this graphic, I named a few like DNA, personal ID number, the cookies in the browsers, because people usually don't clear them. And that's the reason why online identifier appeared in the text of the GDPR. Also IP address, by the same reason, full name and geolocation of the person. There might be other identifiers because the list in the GDPR Article 4 is not comprehensive. And the second layer surrounding our data subject is non-identifying information. I use two expressions for identifier and non-identifying information. I use ID for identifier and info for non-identifying information. This is the information that might relate to a number of people. It does not help somebody to identify you, to distinguish you. For instance, if you have quite common, quite typical beliefs, like the earth is round, this element of information does not allow anybody to identify you, because a lot of people believe that the earth is round. You might have property information, education information, life events information that are connected to some identifier. Only in the case when this info is connected to ID, these two elements become a part of personal data. Let's look again into this definition of personal data. And as you can see over here, it can be split in two parts. The information relating to identified or identifiable natural person. And let's start with the simple one, the data of identified individual. When we have an identified individual, that means that you have identifier inside the information, and you might have just an identifier, or you might have identifier surrounded by additional information. I have two examples. First example is someone named Sergey. In this sentence, you have just an identifier. You don't have any additional information to this information. Another example, when you see a full face of a person, complete face, and after you saw him or her, it will be quite easy for you to distinguish this person next time. So this face is also his or her identifier. And identifier itself is a personal data. But along with identifier, GDPR says that there might be additional information included into the personal data. For instance, if this person has a house, information itself, information about the property, the ownership, is related to this face, to this person. So in that case, this information of ownership, this information about face becomes personal data according to the Article 4 of the GDPR. And you can express two of these situations with the formula. For instance, when you have just an ID, it's a personal data. When you have an ID with additional information, with non-identifying information, with some info, it's personal data too. But sometimes you have the situations where identifier is missing, where you cannot distinguish one person from another, where you have kind of attribute information, but you cannot connect this information to a particular person. For instance, this house belongs to one of them, and you cannot distinguish one of the persons. You cannot tag this person. So this information consisting of non-identifying information and without any additional data, without identifier, is considered to be anonymous data. That's why info equals AD, anonymous data. An example of anonymous data is someone with, say, CIPPE certification has a house in Munich. Munich is quite big city, and a lot of people in Munich, quite large number of people, has this popular certification. And this sentence does not contain personal data because you cannot identify anybody with this data. And let's turn to the next part of this definition. We already covered the part of the identified natural person. Let's look into the identifiable natural person. And this is where things become more complicated. I'll start with the examples. Someone with CIPPE certification named Sergey. This sentence does not include direct identifier, complete identifier. It does not contain last name of the person. So you may argue that the person is not yet identified, but the person is identifiable. For instance, if you just select this sentence and Google this sentence, you will find the name, the full name, the identifier on the first page of the Google search. So in that case, you cannot argue that, okay, we don't have direct identifier and the data anonymous, because it's quite easy to complete this identifier and restore the full identifier, like complete direct identifier containing last name and the first name. Another example of this information relating to identifiable nature of person is when you have these 4 individuals, but you have one individual wearing a mask, but this mask just hides just very small fraction of the face. I think you are still able to distinguish this individual without the mask when you meet him somewhere in the crowd, because you can see the shape of his lips, nose, you see the beard, you can see the shape of his face, the color of the hair. So I would argue that in that case, you have an identifier with some little missing information. And in the math, you can express this with ID minus X. So X, it's a missing information, some missing information. Sometimes people don't like maths and they kind of refuse to understand this. So I show another example. I show them, okay, you have an identifier and some additional information. So in case you don't have a complete identifier, you have just part of identifier. This black area, missing part of identifier, can be expressed with X. So it's ID minus X. In that case, you see ID minus X, and in that case, in this example, it's quite obvious that the missing information is quite small. You don't need much effort to find this missing information and identify the person. That's why I included an equation, an inequality in to this formula. So I added if, like a condition, and I'm saying that ID minus X is personal data in case when the cost, when the time, when the effort, when the resources needed for identification are smaller than the benefit that you get from the identification. For instance, in the case of me searching these 2 sets of information, somebody's certification and his first name, when I was searching someone with CIPP certification named Sergey, I spent some resources for the search. I spent 2 seconds to find the identifier. So on the one side, you have 2 seconds. On another side, on the value side, you have the fulfillment of your curiosity. In my case, I was curious who's that person with the name Sergey who has this certification. And the value that I got, okay, I found out his full name, so I can contact him and I can ask him an advice on how to pass the exam, etc. The value was bigger than the efforts, than the cost of finding the full complete identifier. This complete identifier is often referred to direct identifier. Let's continue, actually, I would say that this graphic that I drew is more relevant in that case, because over here you are having not just identifier itself, even indirect or incomplete identifier, but you also see some additional information relating to this person. So in that case, you say, okay, this person wearing a mask possesses a house. In that case, the house, the information about the property of this person becomes a part of this information, of this personal information. According to the Article 4 of the GDPR, personal information is not just identifier, it's also any information relating to the identifier. So you can express it with the formula ID minus X plus info. So incomplete identifier and additional information are personal data if the value of the identification is bigger or equal to the cost of the identification, to the cost of finding this missing information. So you may do the same. You may Google someone with CIPP certification and you can find Sergei Voronkevich. And in that case, you also learn that Sergei Voronkevich is an owner of a house in Munich. And you can use somehow this information by sending him an advertisement of some services in Munich, because he's a house owner. He probably needs some housekeeping or may require some services in the garden. So you might get some value, not just from the identify itself, but from this fact that he's an owner of the house in Munich. And the condition is the same as above. The value of identification should be bigger than the efforts, time, resources, and the cost of the identification. And I shall say that when we speak about the cost, it does not mean just a monetary value, just euro or dollars or anything else. It relates also to the time necessary for identification and the manpower or effort you need for the identification. And this happens in certain technological environment. For instance, over here, I have an internet access and I can Google something. So it's a technology of search engines that is available to me. As a result, I don't need much time and effort. I don't need the same time and efforts that I would need it in 1990, where search engines were not present. And the value is also can be expressed, is also can be not just monetary value, not just money, but also some feelings, some ideas. For instance, your curiosity, the feeling of anger, the feeling of revenge, or the feeling of some ideals may force you to identify someone. Let's return to our formula of identifiable person. So in case of identifiable individuals, you have either incomplete or indirect identifier, or incomplete identifier with some additional information. And speaking about anonymous data, let me show you, and you can compare two examples. Here you can see a person wearing a mask, and you don't need much effort to find out how his face looks like. But on the similar picture, you have also a person wearing a mask, but the mask is bigger. It covers the most of the surface of his face, You may have an idea about his hair color, that he has a beard, but you would require much more efforts to find out how he looks. In that case, in the absence of additional information, in the absence of technology, in the absence of other picture, you have a situation where you also have an identifiable person, but the efforts, the cost of the identification are huge. It would be unreasonable for you to put so much effort in just to fulfill your curiosity. So in that case, you also have an expression of identifiable person, ID minus X plus info. But in that case, it's anonymous data because the efforts, time, resources, and the technology much higher than potential value or benefit that you can get from the identification. Where are those time, cost, manpower, and efforts come from? I analyzed three major sources. This is the GDPR itself, one of the recitals relating to the paragraph 1 of the Article 4 of the GDPR. The case law by European Court of Justice, and modernized Convention 208. And in all three sources, you constantly meet these factors. Everywhere you can find cost and time. It's everywhere, both in GDPR and convention, cost and time should be considered when classifying information as anonymous. But in the GDPR, you also have a technology, and in some case law and in the Convention 208, you have quite similar expressions, quite similar notions of manpower and effort. Using this analysis, I made a conclusion that these four factors should be considered when anonymizing the data. It should be available technology like Google search, money you need to identify the person, time that takes identification, and the manpower or efforts for the identification. Let's look at the full picture. You have anonymous data which can be expressed either by formula info equals to AD, or you have anonymous data of the identifiable person where the efforts, time, and resources are much higher than the value that you get from the identification. In the text of the GDPR, they use the expression reasonable likely expression. And this reasonableness can be expressed with this inequality, with this value smaller than the cost. And in my formula, value stands for monetary values, for immaterial or very subjective values that and benefits that people may get from the identification. This reasonableness is also a part of the explanatory text that goes with the modernized Convention 108. So they also have this factor in deciding whether the data is anonymous. but in the wording of 108 convention, they don't use this likelihood expression, reasonably likely. They say directly whether time, efforts, and resources are reasonable or not. It should be considered a factor when drawing the line between personal data and anonymous data. Another example of personal data you can see in the Article 4 of the GDPR, which describes the process of pseudonymization. In case of pseudonymization, you need some additional information to complete the identifier. And here I use the example from the guidelines by the Singapore Supervisory Authority. They issued the guidelines devoted to anonymization. And they have quite a nice example that I constantly use in my GDPR DPP course. They have an example of the university and some group of students. So before pseudonymization, you can see that Lini Mok, this is the full name of the person, got the 29 hours for preparing. So the result is not great, and that might expose Lini Mok to some mockery by his fellow students. So to lower the risk for Lini Mok, we use some pseudonym for his name, and this pseudonym is this number. And somewhere separately, you also keep the table where you can find out who's this person with this number. So in these two examples, you have personal data. In both examples, you have personal data. But over here, you have ID plus info, the identifier Lini Mok plus info about his results. And over here, you have ID minus X because some information is missing plus info. But this personal data, this is a personal data because this table is available for the university staff. So that's why the value of identification is higher or equal to the cost of identification. Sorry, I made a mistake. It should be the value of identifier so the value of ID. But when you, for instance, delete this table, you don't have this table any longer, and you are not able. It's deleted completely. It's erased from the system. You might argue that this pseudonym, it's still ID minus X, but the cost, I mean the time and efforts and resources and technology needed for restoring this full identifier is too high for anyone, is too high for anybody. So in that case, this information magically becomes anonymous data. This formula helps to evaluate of the reasonableness of the identification. This formula helps to operationalize the definition of personal data. It's sometimes used just to name, to qualify some data as just an ID plus X or plus info, or just ID minus X plus info. And I find it quite useful in the practice, where you show the employees of your clients what personal data is, and then they quite easily can find all the categories of personal data in the systems, answer the subject access requests, or fill in the questionnaires concerning the data register when you collect the information to update your data register. It's required that employees tell what the data they possess and which data are personal. So in case of anonymization, it's a good way to get rid of some requirements under the GDPR by anonymizing the data. So in case of the anonymization, you have to get rid of the identifier completely, or you can make the completion of this identifier quite hard, unreasonable for everyone, because you might think, okay, for my organization, I don't need this identifier for my organization, so then it's anonymous data and I can sell it to someone. But if you send it to some data broker, this data broker has a lot of additional information, and this company can re-identify the person, and in that case you feed it this company with personal data. So it's very important that this formula is true for everyone. For instance, in the recent guidelines by Irish Supervisory Authority, they included the notion of the threat actors, just to underline this important idea that for the data to be anonymous, it should be anonymous for everyone who can access this data. If you are going to publish this anonymized data in the internet, it means that you considered everyone in the internet, and you made a conclusion that for anybody who can get the access to this data, it would be unreasonable to restore this identifier. If someone has a quite high value, high interest in this data, then a value would be higher than the cost of the identification. And in that case, you would say that this information personal. It might be unreasonable for your company to re-identify the person, but for someone outside, for someone in the network, it might be well reasonable to find some additional information. Speaking about personal data should be considered personal if this data is personal for anyone, just for anyone. If the data is personal for one person, then it's personal for everybody else who has an access to this data. So limiting this access, it's a good way to get rid of some additional actors. It's a good way to limit this number of the actors that might access the data, and it's a great way to keep the data anonymous. So I constantly show this receipt as an example, as a case to my students. When I show this receipt, I usually ask them a question. Is this information, is this data on the receipt personal or not? I see a a number of people present, and I want to ask you whether you consider this receipt for yourself or for somebody else personal or not. Do you have an idea? Should we consider this data personal? Should we follow GDPR when we process this data or not? Any ideas? Okay, it looks like most of the people would not are too shy to answer, but I'll tell how it goes in my course. A lot of people say this receipt does not contain personal data because it has just waiter name, Liam, and it would require unreasonable efforts to find out whose this Liam is. It's true, but things change when I say, okay, what if I made a bid? What if I offer you 10,000 euro for the identification of this waiter? Then people would say, okay, in case we have the value of 10,000 euro, we would say that this name and this information on the receipt constitutes personal data. Because for 10,000 euro, we can hire some private detective and find out the name. And once I was delivering this course in Moscow, in the Higher School of Economics, and there were a lot of information security guys in the audience. And one of people came to me after the class and showed me the Facebook profile of this waiter. I got this receipt from internet, and he was able to find out the full name of the waiter. He found this restaurant. Then he looked into the list of the subscribers in their Facebook page. So he figured out by the first name who could be the waiter, and then he just found the guy who had this name and who had information about his previous job in the profile. And I did not pay him 10,000 euro. He considered it quite challenging for him, a good challenge for him. So he was just practicing his skills of finding and searching for information. And in that case, you can see that the value of his curiosity and the value of this feeling of achievement overcame the time and cost of his searching the web. So after this case, I asked one of my interns to Photoshop this receipt, to change the first name of the waiter, to change the name of the restaurant, so none of my following students would bother to search. But it's a good example of how the value, the cost, how the value of this information may influence whether it's personal data of identifiable person or it's anonymous data containing some information of identifiable person. So it's 2:00 and I'm open to your questions. I have some messages in the chat. So Uwe asks, okay, Uwe commented, I think it's even more easy to know his first name. You know where he's working, you have a telephone number, there even not so much money needed to get more confidential information. Yeah, I agree with Uwe, because you have a telephone number of this restaurant and you can call, you can say, oh, I'm a relative of the Liam and I'm worried about his health. Could you share his current phone number? I wonder if he's healthy in this age of coronavirus. And you would use some social engineering to find out his full identifier and contact information, etc. All right, so thank you for your attention. Bye-bye, everyone.